Today's lesson is the deliciously ambiguous history of potato chips. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to talk about the history of a snack that is very common in the United States and other countries, and it's also very common here in Taiwan. We're talking about potato chips. Are you a great consumer of potato chips, Mike?
I'm not much of a consumer of potato chips, but I do like potato chips. I think of all the sort of junk food things you can buy in a 7-Eleven or a place like that. I think potato chips would be one of the things I buy most frequently, but I don't eat a whole lot of potato chips, I have to say, these days. Some of the flavors I just don't find that appealing, but the story of potato chips I do find very appealing because it's so mysterious. It's such a strange history, and we're going to be learning and reading all about the mysterious and ambiguous history of potato chips coming up right now. The deliciously ambiguous history of potato chips. Crunchy, salty, and deliciously greasy. It's easy to see why potato chips are one of the world's favorite snack foods. But as well known as potato chips are, their history is full of surprises.
大家好，标题中我们看到单字 ambiguous， 这个字是形容词，表示不明确的、模棱两可的或是含糊不清的，像是The ambiguous language of the law made it difficult to interpret. 法律语言暧昧不清，让人难以解读。或者 During the press conference, the politician made some ambiguous comments about the economy. 在记者会上，这位政客针对经济发表了一些模棱两可的见解。另外补充这个字的同义形容词 obscure, O-B-S-C-U-R-E, obscure, 表示模糊不清的或是无名的。我们可以说 Students could not understand the obscure concept. 学生们无法理解这个模糊的概念。或是 This poem was written many centuries ago by an obscure poet. 这首诗是几世纪以前有一位鲜为人知的作家所写。
Okay, so this is rather an interesting title here, The Deliciously Ambiguous History of Potato Chips. Now, deliciously, of course, is an adverb. It's from the adjective delicious. So, indeed, potato chips are delicious to most people. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who don't particularly like them. But we're talking about the ambiguous history of potato chips. And if something's ambiguous, well, we're just not really sure. People, of course, are trying to talk about who invented the potato chip. Well, we don't really know. There are a lot of theories. We also have theories about why we call beef sandwiches hamburgers, for example. They don't have ham in them, but we still call them hamburgers, and nobody really knows why they're called hamburgers.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's a history that's kind of unclear, we can talk about it being ambiguous. And deliciously, of course, it's kind of a joke. We're talking about potato chips, but we're also saying it's very enjoyable. It's really interesting, this unusual, strange, ambiguous history of potato chips. So not only are the chips delicious, but when we talk about something that's really enjoyable, a deliciously gossipy news conference, you might talk about, when two stars are having a fight and all the good stuff that comes out, and we're just relishing it, we're just enjoying it, so we can use delicious in that kind of way too. Let's look at the article. It says crunchy, salty, and deliciously greasy. It's easy to see why potato chips are one of the world's favorite snack foods. Well, there you go. It wraps it up very well. They're crunchy. There's that nice crunch sound when you bite into them. They're salty, so they go with lots of food, and you always want more. And they're deliciously greasy. It's true. You don't want to eat potato chips with your best silk shirt, because if you drop a chip on it, you'll get a grease spot, but people still enjoy the taste. So it's easy to see why potato chips are one of the world's favorite snack foods. But as well known as potato chips are, their history is full of surprises. So everyone knows potato chips, but you might not know the history, and even if you do, you're still going to be surprised.
Right, so that's our introductory paragraph, and I guess we should mention that potato chips are referred to as such in North America, but I believe if you go to England, they will refer to them as potato crisps. So be aware of that difference. But, of course, we're from North America here, Mike and myself, so we're going to refer to them as potato chips. Let's move on now to the second part of our lesson. We'll listen to it first, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
Most people believe the invention of potato chips occurred in New York in 1853. As the story goes, American railroad magnate and millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt was dining in a restaurant in the popular resort town of Saratoga Springs when he was served up fried potatoes that were too thick for his preference. He sent them back to the kitchen untouched, demanding a new portion. Furious at this customer, the chef, George Crumb, cut up the potatoes incredibly thinly and cooked them until they were extra crispy out of spite. However, to Crumb's surprise, when Vanderbilt received his new potatoes, he loved them. From there, it didn't take long for potato chips to become a sensation. Still, even though this story has persisted through the years, it has been proved false.
第二部分我们看到名词 magnate， 这个字也可以念 magnet， 指大亨、富豪或是工商界巨头。例如 Karen's friends were amazed when she announced her engagement to the famous chocolate magnate. 当 Karen 宣布她和巧克力大亨订婚时，她的朋友都大吃一惊。或是 The oil magnate was one of the world's richest men. 那位石油大亨是世界上最有钱的人之一。另外补充这个字的同义字 tycoon, T-Y-C-O-O-N, tycoon, 意思是企业界的大亨或是巨头。像是 The oil tycoon was accused of financial fraud. 那位石油大亨被指控金融诈骗。也可以说 Mark Zuckerberg is the tycoon who founded Facebook. 马克·祖克伯是创立了脸书的企业巨头。
All right, so as promised, we're going to talk about the history of potato chips, and we begin the second part of our lesson. Most people believe the invention of potato chips occurred in New York in 1853. Now, if you're talking about New York, you could be referring to the city or the state, but in this particular case, we're talking about New York State. And there is one theory, most people believe this theory, that potato chips were invented in New York State in the year 1853.
Absolutely. That's the story that I've heard, and as the story goes, this is sort of the legend, the history as most people know it, of the potato chip. So the history goes, or the story goes, American railroad magnate and millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt was dining in a restaurant in a popular resort town of Saratoga Springs when he was served up fried potatoes that were too thick for his preference. All right, so already this story is a little different from the story that I remember hearing. This one involves an American railroad magnate and millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the most famous names of American industrialism and capitalism, up there with the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. The Vanderbilt family was worth billions of dollars in its time, and they made their money through the railroads. They built a lot of the railroads that connected east and west coasts of America, and someone is sort of in charge of a business in that way, a really dominant presence, maybe has a monopoly in a business. We often might use this word magnet. Notice it's not magnet like the kind of thing that points north or attracts iron to it. Here it's a magnate or a magnet. We can say it that way, basically meaning a very, very powerful business person who controls a huge amount of a certain industry and, of course, is also very wealthy. In his case, he was a millionaire. At that time, he was a millionaire, but I think if you converted the money to modern value, he would probably have been a billionaire. But basically, we're saying this is a very rich, rich person. And he was dining in a restaurant in the popular resort town of Saratoga Springs. This was sort of the Elan or the Hualien or something like that of America back then. People would go there for the healthy water they would get from the natural spring water of Saratoga Springs. I think they built a big racetrack there. So it was kind of a playground for the wealthy. A few hours away from the, busy New York City, they could go to this place, get some fresh air, go swim in a nice lake. But anyway, it's a resort. It's a holiday town. And there he was eating in a restaurant, and he was served up fried potatoes that were too thick for his preference. When you're served up something, we could also just say he was served fried potatoes. So this is just a term to talk about giving food that has been prepared for a person who is there waiting to eat it. The difference that I remember is that in the other stories I heard, it was a rich guy in a resort town in a restaurant in Saratoga, but they never actually said it was Cornelius Vanderbilt. That's a bit of a twist.
We should mention that fried can refer to two different kinds of cooking. One is to actually cook something in a pan on a stove with oil or something like that, but also you can deep fry things like French fries or fried chicken. Those are deep fried, and in this particular case, I'm guessing that the potatoes were deep fried in oil, and so he was served up those fried potatoes, but he got them on his plate, and like a lot of rich people, he went, what is that? I'm not going to eat that. That is dog food. Send it back and bring out what I wanted. So again, they were too thick for his preference, and so he sent them back to the kitchen. And they were untouched when he sent them back to the kitchen. Hopefully, of course, he did not actually try to eat them. They were the same as they were when they came out of the kitchen. And he was demanding a new portion. A portion, of course, is an amount of food that you are served when you go to a restaurant. And he was demanding a new portion. Take these back to the kitchen and send me something else. These are too thick. I want them thinner.
All right, so obviously the cook had to do something different to please this customer, especially if it was the famous Cornelius Vanderbilt. But this chef, George Crumb, we learn, well, he wasn't too happy about this. It says furious at this customer, the chef, George Crumb, cut up the potatoes incredibly thinly and cooked them until they were extra crispy out of spite. Wow, so this is really not a happy chef who is not looking to please his customer. He's looking to make his customer angry because the chef feels that the customer is wasting his time. That's why he's furious. If you're really angry with someone, you are furious with that person, so you're turning red in the face and you've just had enough. And in this case, the person who is furious is person you don't really want to be furious with, the chef in the restaurant. The chef would be the head cook, basically, the person who's in charge of the kitchen, decides on the menu, makes sure all the food looks good when it goes out into the restaurant. So this is the person who's in charge of making the food. And this gentleman, George Crumb, who was the chef, the cook at this restaurant, they're too thick. He's thinking, all right, well, I'll show you, Vanderbilt. So he cut up the potatoes incredibly thinly, like slightly thicker than a piece of paper, as we know potato chips are, and then he cooked them until they were extra crispy. He basically decided to almost burn the potatoes, and he did this out of spite. When you do something out of spite, you do it out of anger. You're kind of showing a person that you've pushed me so far, I'm losing my temper, and now I'm going to do something just to show you how mad I am. I'm going to do something mean to you just because you did something to make me mad. So this is his idea. If the potatoes are too thick, fine. I'll make you super thin, crispy, almost inedible ones that you won't want to eat because they just won't be good. But it turned out that they were good.
However, to Crumb's surprise, when Vanderbilt received his new potatoes, he loved them. Yeah, he probably said, yeah, that's exactly how I want them. And from that time on, it didn't take long for potato chips to become a sensation. So Mr. Vanderbilt probably went back to congratulate the chef. Wow, that's really a great way to serve those fried potatoes. You could probably make more. So they probably made more and more of them, and word spread throughout upstate New York and the rest of the eastern United States and the rest of North America. And they became quite popular. And yes, indeed, they became a sensation. If something's a sensation, of course, they are really popular, and people are going nuts about those things. Just like a couple of years when Jeremy Lin started playing really well for the New York Knicks, he became a sensation.
Oh, absolutely, he sure did. Still, even though this story has persisted through the years, it has been proved false. So here we get into the ambiguous history of the potato chip. I mentioned that I've heard this story many times, so the story has persisted through the years. If something persists, that means it kind of continues on. It sticks around. We often use it when there's something that we wouldn't want to have stick around, possibly, or something that you would expect to have kind of disappeared, like having a phone in your home is something that still persists to this day. Most people don't even use the phone phone in their home, or maybe don't even watch much of their television. They watch things on their computer, on their smartphone, but these machines still persist in our phones. They still stick around, even though you might expect them to have gone away through history or through change. So you might have expected this story to have gone away because it has been proved false. It's been proved to be untrue, but the story persists, probably because it's just a good story.
So where did potato chips come from? We're going to find out as we continue with the third part of our lesson.
No one has been able to identify the inventor of potato chips with certainty, but there are some interesting theories. Some believe that Crumb's sister, who had worked alongside him in the same kitchen, was actually the person responsible for their invention. Indeed, her obituary maintained that she was the creator of the snack. Another theory is that they were invented by a British physician who had written a cookbook to instruct people on proper nutrition. Published in 1817, the cookbook contained a recipe for potato slices or shavings that were to be fried in lard and then sprinkled with salt. It's fascinating that something as ordinary as potato chips could have such a mysterious origin. But this disputed history aside, one thing is certain. Whoever came up with this snack did us all a huge favor.
最后第三部分，我们看到动词 instruct 指指导、传授、讲授知识、技能等，或是命令、吩咐。例如 ，When we feel under pressure, the nervous system instructs our body to release stress hormones. 当我们感受到压力时，神经系统会指示我们的身体释放压力荷尔蒙。或是 The sales manager instructed his team to learn more about the company's products. 业务经理吩咐他的团队要多了解公司的产品。另外补充两个和 instruct 有关的名词，第一个是 instruction, I-N-S-T-R-U-C-T-I-O-N, instruction, 意思是指示、教学或是操作指南。像是 This school offers English instruction to non-native speakers. 这所学校有为非母语人士提供英语教学。也可以说 If you can't figure out how to put the desk together, just read the instructions. 如果你搞不懂怎么组装这张桌子，就看说明吧。第二个是 instructor, I-N-S-T-R-U-C-T-O-R, instructor. 这个字是名词，意思是指导员或是教师。像是 The swimming instructor told her students to get out of the pool and dry off. 那位游泳教练叫他的学生离开泳池并擦干身体。或是 Carla's dance instructor put together a show that all of the students danced in. Carla 的舞蹈老师安排一场所有学生一起跳舞的表演。
Okay, it's time for us to discuss the third part of our lesson. It says, no one has been able to identify the inventor of potato chips with certainty. If you identify someone, you basically can say who they are. You might be asked to identify yourself if you go to a university or someplace like that to say who you are. And certainty here just refers to the state of something being certain or for sure. So no one can really say for sure who invented potato chips.
That's right. And some of them are just a variation on the story that we just read. For example, some believe that Crumb's sister, who had worked alongside him in the same kitchen, was actually the person responsible for their invention. So the story doesn't change much. It's just that the angry chef wasn't George Crumb. It was his sister, because she worked alongside him. Basically, she worked next to him. You could be standing alongside a person by standing actually right next to them, but you can also say you work alongside, or I went to school alongside. That just means at the same time, in the same place, you kind of like you were a colleague or something like that. So his sister was actually working there at the restaurant restaurant, so maybe she cooked them. That was one of the twists in the story. Indeed, it says her obituary maintained that she was the creator of the snack. Well, that is a bit of an interesting fact. When she died, what they printed in the newspaper a few days after her death to announce her death and to sort of put in the memorial a little bit of her personal history, it said that this lady, Mrs. Crumb, whatever her name was, passed away. She's famous for inventing the potato chip back in 1853. That's what it said in her obituary, printed in a local paper.
Makes sense. Of course, back then, they probably didn't like it when women would try to take the credit. So, of course, the chef, Mr. Crumb, probably wanted to take all the credit. And another theory is that they were invented by a British physician who had written a cookbook to instruct people on proper nutrition. So now we're going to the UK, and we've got a doctor or a physician. And this theory says that this guy invented the potato chip. And he had written a cookbook to instruct people on proper nutrition. So if you instruct someone, you teach them about something. And he wrote a cookbook, and I guess he had a recipe in there for potato chips.
And it says published in 1817, the cookbook contained a recipe for potato slices or shavings that were to be fried in lard and then sprinkled with salt. So this is 40 years or so before George Crumb ever claimed to invent them. There was this cookbook that was actually written and printed, and I guess you can still find a copy in a history museum. And in this cookbook, one of the early cookbooks, it contained, or it had in the book, a recipe for potato slices or shavings, basically thinly cut potatoes. We would call that a potato slice. And these were to be fried in lard, cooked in hot oil, and then sprinkled with salt. Sounds like potato chips to me. Because, of course, potato chips are fried in lard, in hot oil. Lard is a solid oil that comes from off, I think, the fat of pigs and animals, right? And then you melt it down and it becomes oil, basically. It becomes the oil that we would think of when we think of frying things like potato chips. So you fry these thin-cut potatoes, these slices, in oil, and then you sprinkle them with salt. You sort of dust them with salt. You have some salt in your fingers. You have the potato chips in a bowl, and you sort of drop the salt from a height over the potato chips, mix them up a little bit, put in a bit more salt, boom, there you go, potato chips.
They can be quite salty and greasy, so yeah, you can eat them sometimes, but don't eat them every day. And here in the final paragraph it says, it's fascinating that something as ordinary as potato chips could have such a mysterious origin. Indeed, it's a simple snack, but we just don't know where they came from. But this disputed history aside, if we don't talk about the history that is ambiguous, one thing is certain, whoever came up with this snack did us all a huge favor. So if you do someone a favor, you really help them out, and indeed, life would not be the same without the humble potato chip. That brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Let's listen now to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny， 今天要练习文意选填的题型，我们来快速浏览题目的10个选项。 A. Disputed， 它可以是动词 dispute 的过去式或过去分词，表示争论争执。那它其实也可以用过去分词来当形容词，却描述是有争议的。 B. Cut up 是片语动词，它当及物用的时候呢，我们就可以用 cut something up 或者是 cut up something 去表达把什么来切片切块。那要特别注意 cut 的三态同形哦。好，那么 C. Occurred 它可以是动词 occur 的过去式或是过去分词，去表达出现啊、存在或是发生。D. Sensation 是名词，它有感觉、知觉的意思。那这个字也常常用来指造成轰动的人事物。E. Contained 它是动词 contain 的过去式或过去分词，表示包含、含有、包括。它还有那种控制、遏制、阻止，像是可能控制、遏制某个有害物的蔓延、扩散等等的意思。那它是及物动词哦。好，再来看到 F. Nutrition 它是名词，表示营养。G. Identify 是动词，表示确认、辨认。H. Untouched 它是形容词，形容原封不动的或是未经改变的。那么 I. served up 表示端上提供，可能像是提供某个食物餐点等等。特别注意这边的 served 它有可能是过去式或过去分词。 J persisted 它可以是动词 persist 的过去式或过去分词，表示继续存在、持续或是存留。那注意它是不及物用法。现在我们就来做题目咯。第一题他说到Most people believe the invention of potato chips 空格in New York in 1853. 我们看到 believe 后方其实是一个 that 子句，但它省略了 that。那么子句里面的主词是 the invention of potato chips 洋芋片的发明，然后后面要接一个动词嘛。那动词这个空格后面是直接接了地点跟时间，它的时间是在1853年，所以像过去式。那我们就是要用有不及物用法的动词咯。符合的选项有 A disputed, C occurred, J persisted。 好，从语义上来看应该是要选 C occurred 去表达说洋芋片的发明发生在1853年。好，再看到第二题他说when he was 空格 fried potatoes that were too thick for his preference。 空格前面我们看到了有主词 he 和动词 was， 然后后面有受词 fried potatoes， 可以推断它是用被动语态。那空格里面呢，我们就是要填入过去分词 PP 咯。符合选项有 A disputed, E contained 和 I served up。根据语义呢，应该是要选 I。我们说 serve up somebody something 就是表达提供某人食物餐点咯。好，再看到第三题，他说 He sent them back to the kitchen 空格逗号 demanding a new portion。 空格前方我们看到是完整的句子 send something back to 加名词就可以表达把某事物送回点点点。那后方还可以接一个补语去说明状态，这个补语你可以用形容词，或是说你有时候也可以用这种过去分词来当形容词的用法。好，我们来看看符合的选项有哪些。我们符合的选项呢有 A disputed, E contained 或是 H untouched。 根据语义应该要选 H 去表达说它原封不动的送回厨房了。那第四题他说到 Furious at this customer, the chef George Crumb 空格 the potatoes incredibly thinly and cooked them 点点点。我们看到空格前方有主词 George Crumb， 后面有受词 the potatoes 和副词 incredibly thinly， 而句子的时态又是用过去式，所以这边呢我们说有受词要用过去式，你就是要填入有及物用法的过去式动词。符合选项有 A disputed, B cut up, E contained。 那根据句意应该是要选 B 咯。 Cut up the potatoes incredibly thinly 就是把马铃薯切得相当薄的意思。再看第五题 From there, it didn't take long for potato chips to become a 空格。看到空格前面就有不定冠词 a， 我们就要填入单数名词。选项当中的名词有 D sensation 和 F nutrition， 可是 nutrition 不可数，所以就只能选 D sensation， 表示造成轰动的人事物了。第六题他说 Still, even though this story has 空格 through the years。 我们看到空格前方它有用到这个主词 this story， 还有 has 它可能是动词也有可能是助动词。再看到空格后面是介系词片语 through the years， 我们可以推断空格里面是要填入有不及物用法的过去分词哦。所以符合选项有 A disputed 和 J persisted。根据句意应该要选 J persisted 去表达那个故事持续存在流传了很多年的意思。再看到第七题他说 No one has been able to 空格 the inventor of potato chips with certainty。 好，空格前方有主词 no one， 还有动词的部分是 has been able to。 当我们看到 be able to 后面就是要接原形动词，所以符合选项就只有 G identify 表示确认辨认的意思。第八题他说点点点 a British physician who had written a cookbook to instruct people on proper 空格，空格在句尾嘛，那前面又有介系词 on 和形容词 proper， 我们就可以推断空格里面要填入名词。符合选项只剩下 F nutrition。再看到第九题他说 Published in 1817, the cookbook 空格 a recipe 点点点。 空格前面我们看到了主词 the cookbook， 然后空格后面是有名词 a recipe， 我们可以推断 a recipe 它是要当受词用，所以空格里面就是要填入有及物用法的动词咯。符合选项有 A disputed 和 E contained， 根据句意应该要选 E contained 去表达说这本烹饪书里有包含一份食谱。好，再看到第10题，他说 But this 空格 history aside, one thing is certain。空格前方我们看到了定冠词 this， 然后后方有 history 这个名词，我们可以知道说空格里面要填入形容词来修饰 history， 那就只剩下选项 A disputed， 它就可以是 dispute 的过去分词来当形容词 disputed， 描述有争议的。好，那么以上是今天的讲解，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Ambiguous. The politician's reply to the question was ambiguous. Demand. Keith demanded a refund when he discovered that his watch didn't keep time accurately. Furious. Chelsea was furious to learn that her husband had bought a new car. Chef. Wesley worked hard to become the head chef of a well-known restaurant. Certainty. I can say with certainty that I've never met her before in my life. Alongside. You'll work alongside a senior staff member until you become familiar with the job. Instruct. The captain instructed us on the proper procedure to follow in an emergency. Sprinkle. Emma sprinkled some sugar on her cereal and sat down to eat.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.